So again, I'm Adrian Treves, Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm going to pick up on a few of the talks from yesterday and also delve more deeply into the public trust doctrine. I'd like to, in particular, address the comments of two of our speakers, Daryl and Jim, about the North American model for wildlife management and whether its historical importance, which is unquestioned, is actually enough to carry it forward, or if the gaps in it may be too significant. And then to go on to show how a modern use of the public trust doctrine may address the problems that we see today, and in particular, the issue of intergenerational equity that I'll define and I'll explain, and the need for different user groups to work together against the common problem of illegal uses. So let me start by just a reminder about where the modern public trust doctrine really gets its start, not only in New Jersey with the 1842 Martin versus Waddell decision, but a series of Supreme Court decisions. And the landmark case of Illinois Central 1892 is really important. Many of you may recognize this picture from the turn of the 20th century of the Lakeshore Drive area in Chicago, where the Illinois Central Railroad was granted land for this rail yard, and then the state reclaimed that land for public use because public use of the shoreline for all of its uses of water and land had been infringed, impaired by the railroad yard. That went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the landmark decision here, it's worth reading both for the precision of the words they use and this 19th century language that inspired so much interest in the environmental public trust in the U.S. and across the world eventually. So it says, trusts connected with public property cannot be placed entirely beyond the control of the state. Sorry about that. Beyond the direction and control of the state. The control of the state for the purpose of the trust can never be lost except as to such purposes as are used in promoting the interest of the public therein, or can be disposed of without any substantial impairment of the public interest in the lands and waters remaining. That's a crucial principle, and elements of it have been forgotten, most notably by the proponents of the North American model. And to give you evidence for that statement, I'm going to point you to this 2010 technical review entitled The Public Trust Doctrine, published by the Wildlife Society and a set of other associations of fish and wildlife agencies. So these are the professional societies of our government agencies, state, provincial, federal, across North America. These are the government trustees who are supposed to be serving the public interest for wildlife. And in the synopsis to this document, they articulate these 7 principles. And remember, the synopsis is front and center. It's the first major section of text. It's like the executive summary. It's the abstract. It's what most people are going to read and stop right there. And in these 7 principles, there are some good ideas. And the North American model deserves praise for its historical importance in preventing or stopping the unregulated use of wildlife. There are some good ideas in these principles, as Daryl pointed to, as Jim pointed to. Ideas about the use of science, allocating wildlife by law, and that wildlife are a public resource. However, Principle 7, the democracy of hunting, is actually inconsistent with the public trust by isolating one particular use, a single use. And the public trust has been extensively, this document and the North American model have been extensively analyzed by legal scholars, notably, most recently, Susan Clark and her colleagues, who concluded that the democracy of hunting should be chucked. It should be gotten rid of because it's a special interest, and all uses, all legally recognized uses, are equivalent under the public trust. And granting preference to hunting not only is unfair and unjust and undemocratic, but it also directs funding because these government agencies are often responsible for much of the funding for research, outreach, and extension. And therefore, it's creating another division in society which is not called for under the public trust doctrine of the Wildlife Trust. Furthermore, in that same synopsis, the authors show that they've taken sides in a value debate within society. To show you this, let me just read one part of the, did it again. So one part of the text, actually I'll just summarize it, let you read the words for yourself. The summary of this statement is that there are threats they perceive to the public trust, threats to the North American model, threats to the laws and management principles in states, provinces, and the federal agencies. And then they name those threats in this same synopsis. They name the several threats, including the 4 listed here, about access to property for hunting, about animal rights, about personal liability issues. Those are value debates occurring within society, and when our government trustees take sides and name those values, certain values, as threats, they're directly infringing on the public trust, because the public trust encompasses all legally recognized uses, and last time I checked, these are all legally recognized values or uses of wildlife, uses in the broadest sense. It can be simply appreciation or aesthetics, all the many uses we've discussed. So let me return to Roosevelt, who was one of the architects of the North American model and a very powerful writer and orator. And in particular, he was powerful on the point of intergenerational equity. This quote is in that 2010 technical document. However, I feel the authors neglected its larger, more significant message. And please read this up to the point of the boldface section, which I'll read to you, because it's wonderful 20th century language, and Roosevelt was visionary. Even if you can criticize him for other views, I believe he's correct. That our duty is to the whole, including the unborn generations. And it bids us to restrain an unprincipled present-day minority from wasting the heritage of these unborn generations. This kind of language and the principle of Illinois Central 1892 that we cannot impair the trust asset with our uses, that it belongs to all citizens, current and future generations. That's been referred to as the principle of intergenerational equity, and it has 2 parts. Those 2 parts are that future generations have a right, the democratic right to self-determination. That's democratic with a small d. It's a principle of democracy, of self-determination, namely that they're going to decide what are the legal uses of wildlife. We can't decide for them. And moreover, that our uses of this legacy of environmental assets that includes wildlife, our uses cannot impair the principle, because we need to hand it down to those future generations for them to determine themselves what to do. And I want to evoke some of the mythology that we've wrapped wolves in to think about. Future generations are going to decide if wolves are the foster mother that allowed the founding of Rome in myth, or if wolves are really the monster in Little Red Riding Hood. It's not for us to decide. Now, all right, so that's aspirational maybe, and maybe you dismiss it, but on a practical standpoint, it's worth looking at wolf policy in Wisconsin, for instance, through the lens of intergenerational equity and the modern public trust doctrine. So the height of this bar indicates the number of wolves that were handed back to the state in January of 2012 after federal delisting. A minimum count placed it at 815 wolves. And I'm going to adopt the terminology and stance of the state that counts individual wolves, although I personally don't agree with that approach. They then dedicated a quota for harvest, which would leave intact the green portion of the bar, as preserving the principle of the asset at a level of 350. We've heard a lot of discussion about that number. The remainder, the blue bar, was allocated to lethal users, to regulated harvest, to livestock producers that wished for killing wolves, and other narrow interests. I have to raise the question as a scholar whether this represents intergenerational equity, whether it really places different uses, different legally recognized uses on an equal footing, and whether it represents substantial impairment. If we instead take the same population of 815 wolves and look at it through the lens of intergenerational equity, it looks more like this, where the green bar again is preserving the principle of the asset for future generations, and the yellow and the reddish bars are that small proportion of interest on the principle, that interest that current generations are allowed to use under the public trust doctrine, and the yellow is perhaps what would be reserved under the ceded territory treaty rights of the Ojibwe across the western Great Lakes, and the red is what is for the rest of all of the other users, again, a minority of which wish to kill wolves by our surveys and those of others. So what I'd like to call for is an alliance, a coalition, a true partnership between the legally recognized users of wildlife to determine what should the legal uses be, and then to make sure we understand what people are paying for. It's the uses that impair the asset that must pay for that right, and they're paying the public interest for what they're taking out of the asset. That's why hunters, for instance, pay fees, why ecotourism that can damage the asset if it's excessive pays for the privilege to use the asset in that way. But the uses that impair the asset deserve our scrutiny. They deserve careful consideration, scientific consideration. And altogether, it's the illegal uses that are the common enemy. And I really would expect those interest groups out there that understand who's doing the poaching, where, and how to step in and act. So I just want to leave you with those thoughts before we move to our panel. And while I invite our panel back up, which would be Jim, Janine, and Peter David, and I'm going to call back Lisa Naughton, who spoke yesterday, to sit on our panel, I'll take a question simply while they're getting set up here at the front. Thank you. I'm not in charge of the mic.
I am great about moving slow. I don't have copy.
I'm pretty focused on the funding of the DNR by hunting licenses and excluding the general public from any saving licenses or any way to participate. And with the funding completely structured around more killing, and really they are exponentially increasing trapping and other abuses of our wildlife. And I also know from the research that we bring, wildlife watchers, for example, in 2006, brought $110 million directly to state tax coffers and generated equal multiplier effects in the economy. And hunters brought $40 million in hunting licenses and $10 million directly to state tax coffers.
Patricia, can I address the question, please?
Sure. All of them.
We really need a well-done, peer-reviewed study of the financing of wildlife in the U.S. At the moment, there's only quite a bit of arm waving and throwing out of statistics that hasn't been peer-reviewed. And I'm personally an advocate for peer review of the highest transparency and highest ethical standards to establish facts. So let me actually address your question and not all the figures you're throwing out, please. Hunters and other users who impair the asset should be obligated to pay for that privilege. Those revenues, though, should be redirected towards the public interest and the broad public interest, not a narrow interest, to address your question. And in this case, the broad public interest has been clearly articulated in Supreme Court decisions, through the leadership, through our state and federal legislative bodies that the broad public interest is in conservation of wildlife and habitats. So the reinvestment, I believe, of those hunter fees, any fees that impair the public trust asset in conservation, seems to be a legitimate use. Let me turn to our panel because I see that they're ready.